Welcome to Church307, Wyoming's online church. We are glad you have joined us today. Would you please like, subscribe, and share this video with people in your room, out of the room, out of your state, out of your county. Just keep the good work going so we can get it out there that this is happening. We are a church that believes you can belong before you believe, and we believe that. With that, Grant, hit it. Yep, send it. I am sitting next to the one, the only, Michael Lawrence Wilson.
Yeah, it seems a little bit weird for you to be welcoming me because I've done this without you.
I know.
For a month.
But I had to come back.
He was in Germany hanging out with Germans.
The Deutschlanders.
Deutschland. And you learned the language.
Yeah, right.
And now he is here to share with us how to speak German.
Yep.
And also the wisdom he gained while he was there. That'll be on
a different episode, not today.
Yeah, that's right. No, today we are joined by my best friend. Somebody that I have known for a long time, since college. He is a Kansas State Wildcats fan. So I brought my Jayhawks mug to welcome Chris McFadden.
Yay!
Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Chris.
Hey, guys.
Good afternoon.
Chris is a pastor in Kansas right now. He is currently working on his doctoral studies, hence the books behind him. The many leather-bound books.
Full of words.
Yes.
Full of words. He is ABD right now, but soon to be Dr. Chris McFadden. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Yeah, guys, thanks for having me. It's good to see both of you across the surging power of the interwebs.
Chris was on staff. Chris was on staff here with us, so we know him. I know him from before that, but that's how Mitch knows Chris, was from when he was the youth pastor and then discipleship guy here at New Life.
There is quite a few memories.
We have stories to tell.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Chris, do you have any embarrassing moments you'd like to share about Mitch, or should we just move on?
I think we should just keep this train moving because that could take a while.
What we need is a Chris's hits after this video is over of
greatest
hits of Chris McFadden.
Yeah.
Who knew?
He was the silly video guy here.
He was the creative person here.
He was the creative talent.
Yeah.
I think I was just more or less like at that point in time, Billy's punching bag.
That's
for whatever
what it was.
Jokes he wanted to land, So
yeah, and they landed very well. So, no, we are here today to talk about hobbies because Chris has some unique hobbies, and so I asked him if he would come on and have a conversation with us about what it looks like for Christians to have a healthy faith/work/hobbies balance in their life, and what does it look like for a Christian to have hobbies. And so I think a good conversation starter in this would be kind of to reflect on what does the Bible have to say about hobbies. And the reality is, I think, not much. I mean, the lifestyle that most of the people in the Bible times, all through that history that they lived, wasn't really one that afforded them much time to spend a lot of time in hobbies like we have today. Most of them were just trying to make it day in and day out, survive, eat, not be killed by their captors, or whatever time in history they were not really too interested in hobbies. I asked this question to a pastor friend one time. I was like, what does the Bible say about hobbies? And he brought up the Paul's statements, whatever you do it working unto the Lord, or whatever version he used. I looked those up. One of those is a Colossians passage. It's more talking about like how we interact with each other. The other time Paul says it is 1 Corinthians, and it's more talking about what we eat, drink. And so neither of those in my mind apply directly to hobbies. But what do you say, Chris? Does the Bible say anything about hobbies?
Well, I think what's interesting is I agree with all that you've already said, Mike, but I would want to say that hobbies show up, or the idea of having hobbies could even be found right off the bat in Genesis 1. And it sounds crazy, but in the creation narrative, where we see that God puts everything together that we know, God spends 6 out of 7 of his days. Of course, we're aware of the work week, or week being 7 days. God spends 6 of those days creating, and we're told right from the beginning, on the 7th day, God rested. And later in Exodus, we'll encounter more of God saying, listen, the reason why I've given you this 7th day, which we call the Sabbath in the church, a day to rest. The reason why I'm giving you this 7th day is because God says, I'm not a cruel master like Pharaoh, right? After Israel's been under Egyptian slavery for many, many years, later God will rescue them. A lot of people know the story. And he'll say, listen, Pharaoh worked you 7 days, right? He worked you 7 days, 365, 24/7. You were a commodity to Pharaoh. I'm going to give you a day off, a day to rest. And right there, I think we should key in on what God is saying. He's saying that we, as people, we need rest, right? We need leisure. And some of the ancients used to call this holy leisure, that rest is good, rest is holy, rest has value. And even God, now I want to point this out because I just preached on Sabbath a few months ago. God says, hey, I want you to work 6 of 7 days, right? I want you to stay busy. I want you to keep at it, but you got to take time to rest. So I don't know. Is there something about hobbies? Could we even start to poke at that box right away?
Yeah. So you would say, I reflect a lot on the 2 Corinthians 5 passage where Paul talks about all the works that you do will be judged either good or bad. And so you would say, I'd put the hobbies in the good category. It's not bad. Some would say, well, it's neither. It's not good or bad. It's just kind of in the middle. You would say, no, if it's part of Sabbath and we think Sabbath is good, it's healthy, it's worthwhile, you'd put hobbies in the good category.
Absolutely, because I know some of the things that we do, our hobbies, our activities, our interests, whatever you want to call them, outside of work, outside family, outside of our job, outside of serving, whatever that might be. Those things, they feed our sense of self. They feed who we are. They give us a different measure of purpose in some cases. Hobbies really play a role in the whole person that we are. Yeah. And I think what's important about it is that sometimes, unfortunately, we live in a world where everybody likes to give that hot take. They like to give that critique. And what happens is in the church world, we get to looking at people's hobbies and we want to start making critiques about what hobbies are good or what hobbies are bad.
Yeah.
Right. Of course, we could all agree that you want to make sure your hobbies don't fall in the category of outright, sin, right? We don't want to do things that outright go against God's way of life, God's commands to us. But outside of that, there's a ton of freedom in our lives to explore holy rest, to explore hobbies and to bring that richness to our lives. But what I'm seeing in the church, people pointing their fingers at each other saying, well, that's a bad hobby. That's not a good hobby, or that's whatever. That's not a manly hobby. That's not something,
Are you attacking the people who cross stitch, Chris? Is that what you're trying to?
Not a cross stitcher.
You saying men can't do that?
As clearly,
I feel like he was really blasting.
I'm a big CrossFitter. As you can tell,
right? Okay.
Obviously,
right. And that makes sense.
That's a joke because this shirt is actually a 2XL. But no, I'm not going to attack any of our sweet grandmas. Okay?
No.
But let me tell you what I think. Let me tell you what I see as a pastor. What kind of one of the things I observe is we get into these culture wars over what hobbies are good or bad. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you don't know me, you don't know this about me, I'm a huge geek.
Yeah.
I'm a huge nerd. Star Wars, Marvel Comics, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. You want to name it. I'm ready to geek out. Let's do it. Let's geek out on it. Let's get geeky. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times what happens is I've run into times in the church where people have said things like, oh, you play board games or you play, you assemble and paint miniature guys and play miniature games. You do this. That's kid stuff. That's nerdy. That's not they don't put that into the good hobby area of like what they expect to be good hobbies. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So there are obviously some hobbies like cross-stitching
Thank you, Mike.
that are acceptable in the church world. Our church has a fantasy football league sponsored by the church. So
I don't think that's a hobby. I think that's a part-time job.
For some of us, it is a part-time job. Yes. So I think, that really becomes the big question, like what hobbies are good and which ones are okay and which ones are not. The church I grew up in took a hard line stance against some hobbies like card playing or dancing or There are some hobbies that we just say, no, those ones are absolute sin. I would say with the nerd culture, like you're talking about, it is one of those that we've kind of shunned. We've kind of said, that's just kind of out there, or I don't know many people who are outwardly nerd culture adherents in the church. That's really largely why you and I are friends. We bonded over the board game table for many a year.
You guys could start a board game podcast.
Yeah, we could. Definitely. Yeah.
That's true. And I don't know if part of that, Mike, I think part of that is related to some of the history of geek culture that I think plays into it. Now, Mike and I were both born in the 80s, back in the days of the 80s. But about somewhere in the early 70s, there was kind of an area, a thing happened in culture we refer to as a satanic panic. You familiar with this term at all?
Satanic panic. I'm not.
Satanic panic.
I'd not heard that.
Well, what happened was in the 70s and into the 80s, there was a number of sort of watershed moments in history where like people came out and they made allegations, and there were allegations that basically America was overrun with satanic cults. And I know this sounds kind of bizarre, but this is really what was happening at the time. Okay. And there was this famous book called Michelle Remembers. And there was this psychiatrist who sat down with this gal who remembered about being abused at the hands of this satanic cult. And later this was proven to be all made up. I mean, this is all implanted stuff that this psychiatrist worked through. So it's a satanic panic going on. And people in America, they were turning their fingers on daycares or any kind of organization that kids were involved in, saying like, we believe there's these cults of satanic worshipers that are causing all this damage in our culture. Now, I think we would say that Satan is at work in our culture. That's a reality. But I'm not sure that the way Satan works is by having people walk around in purple robes and sacrifice children on an altar. I don't think that's really what's happening.
Satan is not more likely to be in Dungeons and Dragons game than he is in. I think my kids are right now really into Pokemon. And I told some friends of mine, they were like, "You guys play Pokemon?" Like that still has this connection to this satanic panic idea. Like the magic or any kind of thing like that still is associated with something that Christians should kind of separate themselves from. And I don't know. I mean, I play Pokemon with my kids, the card game.
How dare you?
Well, sorry. Yeah. But
hey, you got to catch them all. That's just a reality.
Pokemon. But you can't.
And that. There were two, interestingly enough, there were two high-profile deaths that occurred in the 80s, late 70s and the 80s. And both of these deaths of two young men had links to playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? And these people found links in terms of like, oh, they play Dungeons and Dragons with a friend or whatever. And one of these mothers really latched onto this, and she started an organization called BAD in the 80s, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons,
wow.
Okay? And this got national publicity. It was on 60 Minutes. It got national publicity. And here's the whole point. It really cast the geek culture in a negative light in the minds of conservative Christians who are watching TV and consuming this media, right?
Wow. Okay.
And what happens is, as soon as we in the church pit our different hobbies against each other, it just creates a disunity that is absolutely not necessary. And it actually hurts the body of Christ when we walk around and think like, oh man, because I work on trucks or whatever. I'm a mechanic type and I love fixing cars and fixing up trucks, or I go hunting or I go fishing or I play golf. I'm better than the guy wearing the Ghostbusters shirt who paints plastic superheroes. Like suddenly my hobby is somehow better than another person's hobby. And it just creates a level of disunity that I don't think is healthy for the church.
So there's two questions that I think people are probably having in this is, number one, are there some nerd culture activities that are more satanic? Like the one that's coming to my mind is Ouija boards, or like, is there some things that we should be more careful of? And then the second question is nerd culture more all-consuming, or does nerd culture more lend itself to removing people's focus from God and taking their focus and placing it upon their hobby?
I think those are great points. I think first to say, are there aspects of nerd culture that do lend themselves more toward the satanic? I guess maybe that could be true of any genre, right? I mean, there are video games that are more or less violent or sexualized or whatever you want to say, just as much as there is any kind of nerd games, etc. But what I found through my history of being a nerd for 41 years, for my history, is that most games that depict things that are like spiritual are fictitious. It's no more realistic than, say, Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, right? I mean, that's one of the things I've found. Now, the second question you asked, Mike, I think is really what is more important here in terms of what we can drill down on. And that is that does nerd culture predispose us to spend more of our energy on these things, right, than we should be? And that's something, man, I think if I could hit the nail on the coffin, when I consider myself a nerd and amongst nerd culture or geek culture, sometimes nerds are predisposed to become obsessive compulsive about the things that they love. Have you ever read online comments about Star Wars movies when they come out?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Star Wars fans go nuts, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they have
and so
they have strong opinions. I would say I'm in the nerd culture because I do escape room. Like it's a different branch of the nerd culture. For those of you who don't know, actually none of you know, I write a escape room blog, and the people in that culture have become incredibly opinionated about what a room should look like and how it should be laid out. And the designer should do this and not the other thing. But I would say the same thing about, oh man, have you ever watched ESPN? Like the opinions about, I watched PTI, that show where they argue with each other about things that don't matter at all, but they can spend hours and hours arguing about, should this player be traded to this team? And it's kind of any hobby you look at has that.
I'm thinking through guys in our community, because it could be hunting, it could be sports, it could be golf. There's so many that, like, it's just, I would say, even with this nerd culture, it's the having boundaries in your life set up.
Yeah.
So that you aren't becoming so narrowly focused on that alone.
Yeah.
That's exactly, and Jesus said it, right? He said, wherever your heart is you're going to find your treasure there, right? And that's the key. And I think you're exactly right. I know, I know of a story of my own life. When I was first newly married, my wife and I, we ended up moving to Arkansas, take my first ministry position. And she used to work, she's a nurse. She used to work as a night nurse. So depending on how the shifts fell, with the shift week, there'd be 3 or 4 nights a week where I was just home alone. We had no kids yet. And I found a buddy of mine. We began to game. We began to build these miniatures, play miniature war games. You build them, you paint them, you play them. And man, I had 4, sometimes 5 nights a week with nothing to do as a young married. And I would just rush to the game store to play more games, to collect more figures and build more stuff. And so that's the caution I would give. In that period of time, I was like, I can't do this. This is not sustainable. It's not healthy. It's not a healthy boundary.
Yeah. And
that's the caution with our hobbies is when your hobbies take up more space in your heart than the things that you spend, the time you spend on your faith, the time you spend with your family, the time you spend on serving Jesus and his mission, actually physically serving and being involved in your local church and in local missions, the more room the hobbies take up, that's where you can go out of balance, right? And like you said at the very beginning of this conversation, Mike, you turn a hobby from a good thing or a neutral thing to a bad thing, right?
And that makes me, okay, how about this thought? What if your hobby becomes your identity? Because like, I'm wondering, Chris, do you feel like your identity is not as cool now that Marvel, like nerd culture seems almost cool. You have like Stranger Things, you have comic books being cool. There's so many nerdy things that are billion-dollar industries currently. And I hear people who don't know anything about comics say, oh, I'm a hardcore Iron Man guy.
Yeah.
You watched 3 movies.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, I'm more poking fun at that, but
they stole your culture
right,
from you.
They stole your culture from you, but that's more to poke a joke at. Sometimes, like, I do see that around here is people whose hobbies are, it's like their purpose or it is their identity in life.
That's so true. And not only that, I agree with that, Mitch, and I would add to this, the church has not done a good job at engaging with people who are developing those identities. In terms of the church, I've heard pastors rail against nerd culture. I've recently actually saw a clip of a pastor quoting Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 and saying, grown men playing video games, grown men playing cell phone games, they need to put away those childish things. Paul says, put away the childish things when I was a child. Now that I'm a man, I've grown up. Mm. That's not what Paul was talking about.
It's a little out of
bad
context.
Theology.
It doesn't seem right.
Yeah, exactly. But you're so right that identity is key. So one of the things I do for myself, this is just for me, in my social bios, or anytime I have a bio, I like to list the things about myself that I want to keep, that I like. And I have a very specific order I list these things in, and it's like a self-repeating to myself. I'm a Christ follower. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a pastor. I'm a student, and I'm a gamer. So I put those things in order to make sure I remember I can call myself all those things or even add more to that list, but I want them to be in a specific order, right?
Yeah.
First and foremost, that's the order. And so, yeah, having your identity, that's so huge. And that's the problem is some of our nerd and geek buddies can get lost in that.
Yeah. I think, so my district superintendent, Wes Smith, Wes said at one of our pastor gatherings one time, he got up there and he's like, hey, pastors, be interesting. Do interesting things. Have interesting hobbies. And the whole talk was about using your hobbies and using the things that are unique about you in order to connect with people. Because a conversation is easier when you have something in common, or at least I know something about you that I can ask questions about, or ways that we can relate. So if it's if it's subordinate to my faith, if it's subordinate to the things that are more important in my life, then I am able to use it to support those other things. Then I'm able to use it to engage people with a spiritual conversation, or to relate to my sons. I mean, I use most of the hobbies I have incredibly strategically. I mean, I'm out with church people on the golf course. I'm interacting with people. I'm the chaplain of the football team, and I'm able to interact with the football players. And so there's different things that I do, and I say, okay, here's an interest that I have here, and I believe that God can use it in a healthy way in order to further the mission that He's called me to.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you still do it now, Chris. But when you were here in Gillette, through was it HeroClix?
That's right.
And other nerd culture things, you had a large group of young guys that surrounded you. Like you took that
absolutely.
You took that interest and used it to disciple young guys that were in your proximity, which was very cool to see.
That's something I've been thinking a lot about, is exactly what you guys are just saying. How do you leverage your hobbies? Because I do think there's value in a hobby just being a hobby. It's just something you do for leisure. It's just something you do to unwind. But I think God has a special way of leveraging all these activities in our lives for His mission, which is ongoing and constant. Think about the disciples. When He called them away from what they were doing, but at many times He made metaphors and allegories for the kingdom using the stuff that they knew, right? Throw your nets out, catch more fish. Human heaven is like this. It's like soil, because you guys are farmers. It's like this. It's like that. Just last month, I play a game called Marvel Crisis Protocol. Here's a free plug for that game that nobody knows about but me. Anyways, I'm playing this nerd game, right? And last month, I traveled to Kansas City, which is nearby where I live and pastor at. And I played in a 25-person Marvel Crisis Protocol tournament. Okay, so we all got together. We got our figures out. It's all these painted figures you play, move around a table. So here I am. I got to play 5 games. So 5 different opponents, about an hour and a half for each game. I got to spend FaceTime with 5 strangers I did not know for an hour and a half. We were playing a game. We both had common ground already, but we got to ask questions. I got to say things like, "How are you doing? How's life? Are you doing okay?" And there's ministry opportunities coming in the hobby. Now, did I go to the tournament so that I could talk to strangers about their life? No, I went to play Marvel Crisis Protocol. Right? I went to play a game, but through my hobby, I got to engage them on a personal level and make an impression. And I got to do ministry without being a pastor in that location, and it's so cool.
If you have your priorities in order, then the ministry side of it kind of just flows out of who you are. If
that's right.
God is my number one, if if my primary objective in life is to become the person that he created me to be, then in anything that I'm doing, whether it's at work or play or at church, everything I'm doing is kind of leading towards that mission that God has called me to. And yeah, you see it in every area of life. And I think disproportionately with our hobbies. I mean, that I was just out on the golf course this week with a guy who we were out there to play golf, but man, he had some questions about faith, and he's wrestling with some things, and that's an opportunity to have those conversations. Just like I think a lot of pastors, the go-to is, well, I was getting my hair and I was talking to my barber. I'm like, apparently you should never go to a Christian barber, because every pastor's illustration is when they're ministering to the barber. Right. But we have a tendency as pastors and as Christians in general, it's like the longer you're a Christian, the more you're in a Christian bubble. Like all your friends are Christian friends. And so in work, well, you're in a church every day, and in at church and whatever else we're doing, we're just surrounded by Christians. Well, there is a great commission component in our faith that we are missing out on if that's the only circles that we are in. We've got to come up with some excuses, and I've spent so much of my ministry looking for excuses to get outside of the walls of the church, and I'm on the school PTA. Like, who wants to do that? Nobody. But I do that because that's another way that I can interact with people. Now, also, there's some other benefits to it as well, but that's a way that I can get out of the Christian bubble.
Absolutely. And I agree with you, Mike, on that. And I think that hobbies allow us to come to different tables with people that we wouldn't normally rub shoulders with, just like you said. And it allows us, so in that way, we can tune them to work for good. We can tune them to be a part of what we do, a part of our identity, as long as we keep it in the right order. I think that's really important.
So let me ask you a question that seems true to me just because of the nerd culture that I interact with, the escape room nerd culture. It seems to me like there's a disproportionate number of atheists in the nerd culture. Like, it is very rare. So on my blog, I always talk about myself as a pastor. Like, it's my way of intentionally like being unapologetic about who I am. So I was the only time I've ever been recognized for anything outside of just my social circle. I got done with an escape room one time, and the game master comes out of the game and he's like, "Are you Pastor Mike?" And I was like, "Have you gone to my church?" Or like, how does this guy know? He's like, "I read everything you've ever written." And I thought he was talking about the book that I wrote. And then I started asking him questions. He's like, "No, he's an avid reader of my escape room blog." But when he references me, he doesn't say Mike, the escape room blog dude. Because I signed my blog post, Pastor Mike.
Nice.
But he wasn't that was just my title. That wasn't necessarily why he was having the conversation with me. But because I'm a Christian in that world, it is a unique part of the conversations. And usually when I'm talking to game masters or designers, the conversation usually moves more towards what I do for a living than it does just about escape rooms. And so have you seen more of a tendency towards atheism in nerd culture? Or is that just because I'm in a Christian bubble? That's actually what the real world is like.
No, I think you're right. And this goes a little bit back to what I talked about earlier with the culture wars. I think a lot of geeks and nerds have felt cast out of the church because particular churches have said this is what are good hobbies and these are bad hobbies. And maybe during the 80s and 90s, people, you can't play these games like Dungeons and Dragons. You can't play these games, and kind of pushed them out. They felt a little marginalized. Now, granted, part of that is because nerd culture tends to lend itself to more cerebral people, not because they're smarter, but just these games require the use of your brain, right? These are not games that require the use of your body as much. They feel more cerebral, and they tend to be more thinking type of people who've put a lot of thought into this. But the other thing is there is also within nerd culture a toxic attitude towards organized religion. I've found this to be true. In fact, Mike, the way you just put it was so beautiful. I do the opposite. I prefer that people do not know that I'm a pastor until it's necessary.
Yeah.
Because within nerd culture, that can elicit a response of like, oh, you kind of get the side eye, okay. And I found that organically, as I've gained with people over time, if I'm a pastor and it's like, oh yeah, okay, you're a pastor. This is cool. This guy's cool. And he hasn't pushed me in my throat. And then inevitably they'll ask me spiritual questions, which is, I think it's the way the Holy Spirit works in the whole hobby issue,
Yeah.
It always comes up.
All pastors have experienced the moment where you say you're a pastor and all of a sudden people change their language and it's like, oh, I'm going to sit up straighter and I'm going to use less curse words now.
Right.
So that's just part of being a pastor. So as soon as that comes up, but I love what you said about nerd culture being more cerebral and maybe that has pushed them away from the church. I think that's very true. And I've seen that in escape room culture because it's kind of a mental activity. And I think the church, at least in our lifetimes, has been more focused on the emotional appeal and the supporting people's felt needs than it has in the cerebral. I mean, if I have authentic, real questions about faith, now I've got the tool of YouTube, and so a lot of people have replaced church with YouTube because that's where they're getting real questions answered. But I've seen the church kind of shy away from reaching the culture that is more interested in answering difficult questions than it is in just making people feel good. Yeah. And so I think I'm glad YouTube is there so that it can answer some of those questions or whatever other tool you're using.
You're making a great point. I would say that your hobbies help to tune you to opportunities, right?
Yeah.
So because I'm such a geek and a nerd, I can speak a language to these other geeks and nerds who maybe aren't Christians. I can speak a language that not everybody around me can speak.
Yeah.
And also, I rediscovered academics while I was at New Life, actually. In 2015, I enrolled for my MDiv. And I rediscovered the spiritual discipline of study in my life and the good it did for me. And I'm telling you what, sometimes on my day-to-day ministry, I don't feel like all my academics comes into bear. Sometimes it's all ebbs and flows. But sometimes I've been asked hard questions across the gaming table. And I've been ready. God's equipped me to engage those questions in a cerebral way, and that's the Holy Spirit even working in our hobbies, which is so crazy how God knits that together.
And our overemphasis on the spiritual, on the emotional and on the felt needs of people has kind of caused the nerd culture and other thinkers to think, oh, well, there must not be smart people in the church, or it's not that being smart leads you away from faith itself. It's that we have emphasized one at the detriment of the other. And so I think that there is value in allowing ourselves to have the deeper conversations, why we do things like this podcast, so we can have some deeper conversations. Now, there's nothing wrong with speaking to felt needs or to meeting people's emotional needs. I mean, that there is a value in that. And the reality is nerd culture or anybody has felt needs and has emotional needs. And so they need that as well, but we can't neglect the other. You were talking about the nerd culture, the community that happens over the table. And I think there's also something really cool to be said about the fact that the table is the center of the community in nerd culture in so many different ways, similar to the way it was in Christ's community. Am I making too big of a stretch there, or does that enable community to happen in a valuable way?
Absolutely. In fact, that's like the big, if I can pitch one like heady theological thought, it's that one. Table, we come to the table, capital T, right? Christ table. And we mark that in the church as communion, the Lord's Supper, that we all gather at the table and we share in the Lord's Supper. We give thanks to God. We remember his sacrifice. And the great thing about nerd culture that I'm pointing at is when you play tabletop games, you have to go to the table, right? You have to sit across from somebody or beside somebody. And to play these games, you are meeting in a place that has a real time and real space. It occupies real time and space.
Yeah.
And for that reason, my appeal is that geek culture, nerd culture, gaming culture on the table is ripe for spiritual community. Like it should be a harvest for the church, right? To go, man, how do we open our doors? Mitch mentioned years ago when I was at New Life, how I would open the doors for game nights with our students. And I'm not kidding you, Mitch, you brought that up. Just about 4 months ago, a student from my time at New Life messaged me on Facebook and literally said, thanks to our game nights, you made a relationship with me that now, as an adult who's now getting married, I can now say that you had an impact on me in those game nights to stay in my faith.
That's awesome.
That's cool.
And there's real fruit that happens at that table. You know?
I could make the argument that what's happening at a gaming table is more communion than the go stand in a line to grab a cup and a piece of bread and eat it in church. We have taken what Jesus did in the Last Supper, and we've narrowed it down to just the symbolism of the bread and the wine. But what Jesus was inviting them to was much more than eating bread and drinking juice.
Absolutely.
It was much more about the community that's happening around the table as they're drinking that juice or wine and eating that bread.
That's that is so beautiful the way you put that. And the truth is that it's just not, and I want to say it's not only nerd culture, right? I mean, the table of every hobby has a table starting point, you know?
Right.
Like sitting at someone teaching them how to fish, or sitting at showing them how to string a bow or clean a gun, or teaching somebody how to select the right golf clubs or how to swing. Those moments are all table moments, right? Those times we engage our hobbies. So if we put the hobby in order where it goes properly, and we're engaging it with a purpose, like you said earlier, Mike, on mission, hobbies become a positive force. It becomes a good thing that the Holy Spirit can leverage in us, that Christ leverages in us for the good of his kingdom.
So I would say I want to talk also before we end about video gaming. And I mean, you and I, how many hours of Destiny did we play till 3 a.m.?
Guys, we don't have time to recount the hours.
Guys, rating was like the best times of my life.
I don't think there has never been a game better than the first Destiny.
It was amazing. Yeah.
I don't think that, but it was, for one, the game was great.
Yep.
But the community, again, like we had so much fun talking, playing together, working together. Oh, guys.
The game was good. The community that the game built.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about...
I'm crying right now. I mean...
It's okay.
Thank you.
The thing I love about the current trend in video gaming is that it's much more communal than... Yeah. I mean, the video game I used to play, Star Fox, flying around in that jet by myself, nobody else around, had nothing to do with community.
Right.
Current video games are incredibly communal. I mean, my son plays Minecraft. And he's with his other friends building together. They're talking. They're having community over Minecraft. I mean, that's where video gaming... Now, I'm not saying all video games. I do think there's some downsides to one person alone in a room staring at a screen with no community for too many hours.
I'm not saying it's the way or the only way.
Right, yeah. So I would say even within video and gaming culture, there's a good way, a healthy way, and an unhealthy way to do it.
For sure.
Yeah, that's a great point. And another anecdote I had was a few years ago, I was playing a video game online with a buddy of mine who was going through some issues. And we were playing a game and I was just asking him questions about it. And that game, by the time we got to the end of that session, we paused and I said, hey, let's just pray for a minute. Is it okay if I just pray for you and pray over the situation? And I don't know. I mean, we lived 3 states apart at that point. So there'd be no way we would have had that personal touch in that moment. So video games do allow for that. They do build a bridge.
I've just come in contact with a guy who is doing social media addiction counseling. That's like his focus, his emphasis is he counsels people who are addicted to social media. Like the scroll is just, and I think that is a growing issue in our world that is just getting greater. And it's something we need to bring awareness to.
I know when you're talking about that, Chris, you talked about, was it the 80s? The scare you were talking about, the satanic panic?
Yeah, the satanic panic, right.
I'm like, can you imagine if the church attacked social media like it attacked nerd culture in the 80s?
Yeah.
Right.
It seems to be something that does need to be in check a little bit.
I would put within that social media scrolling or whatever you're scrolling, the games that people play on their phones. I have a lot of friends that play a lot of games. There's not much social activity happening in these games. I think there's some, but that are spending a lot of time. And I do think it is worthwhile to warn people. Like, monitor that. Our life group has this habit of looking at our screen time. And so each Sunday, the iPhone pushes out here's how much time you spent on the screen. Our life group has started sharing with each other our screen time usage. And it's just kind of a way for us. Now, we're all parents of young kids. And so our emphasis is, are we giving our kids the attention or our phones the attention? And so that's kind of where we go with it. But I think there's value in us kind of holding each other accountable and helping each other recognize there are good things you can do on their phone.
Yes.
But most times the best thing that you can do is more with the people that you're in the room with. So we're not saying you should replace your in-person relationships or your relationship with your spouse or your kids with online gaming community, but there's value in both, and you should just be intentional rather than having your hobbies have you. You should have your hobbies.
Amen.
Yeah,
that's so good. You could say that again.
Yes. Repeat.
Never. So good. Never heard that before.
Rather than letting your hobbies have you, you should have your hobbies.
You did it. Yeah, that's great.
Repeated it.
Yeah, it's worth it.
You nailed it. You nailed it.
Didn't even write it down.
No. Chris, this has been a real treat.
Yeah, man.
I don't know why we're not doing this on the reg. That's regular.
Hey, I don't know what the reg means, but I do know what regular means.
Thank you.
And that's good. And thanks for inviting me, guys, and letting me talk about something. And I know I'm going to make a really bad pun because I am a dad of 2 daughters, but this topic is kind of a hobby horse for me.
Get out of here.
Hobby horse.
Stop it.
Gosh, this guy. We're both being attacked by a fly, so we're having a hard time focusing.
Yep.
Yes, you are a hobby man, and I don't even know what to say right now because that fly.
Would you do your hobby in a lobby, Chris?
You could do your hobby in a lobby with your friend named Bobby.
Have you ever tried wasabi on your hobby?
I've not tried wasabi, but you could definitely. I can't think of other hobbies.
Sorry, man. I'm just gonna keep lobby these jokes.
I'm out.
All right, well, yeah. Anyway, you're a dude who loves the Lord and loves people and loves to game. So,
yeah, man. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being on the podcast, and we will do this again because you don't just have hobbies. You also have other deep aspects in life that we want to ask you about. So this will happen again. But thanks for doing it.
I appreciate that, guys. It was great to be. And my last piece of advice to you is don't go to a Star Trek convention and say, "May the Force be with you." I can't save you if you do that. Nothing we talked about can save you. Okay?
It took me way too long to figure out why that's a bad idea. I just figured it out, but it took me a long time.
I can't. Yeah, nice. That's great.
I am a nerd.
I can't do that. I can't do it either.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, you want to send us out, Mike?
Awesome. Hey, thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching. If you would please subscribe to this podcast, click like or whatever else the algorithms like. If you would do that, that would be incredibly helpful to us. And as you go, you should know that Jesus loves you unconditionally and he died to give you new life.